The noose was already around her neck when the first drunk stumbled into town. Marlowe Thorne stood trembling on the splintered wooden gallows at the heart of Bitter Creek, her bare feet shifting on sun-warped boards, her hands tied behind her back so tightly that her fingers had gone numb. Wind tugged at her simple cotton dress, streaked with dirt and dried tears, and her cheeks were flushed with heat and fear. The midday sun beat down mercilessly, casting long, grim shadows across the gathered crowd, some curious, some solemn, and some far too eager. She was 23 years old, a seamstress, an orphan, and in less than 10 minutes she'd be dead. Judge Harrison Blackwood, robed in dusty black, stood beside her like a vulture fat with power. His silver hair was slicked back, his cold grey eyes scanning the square. In his hand, he held her death warrant like scripture from on high. His voice rang out across the crowd like a cracked bell. "Marlowe Thorne, you have been found guilty of theft, specifically the larceny of my wife's emerald necklace, an heirloom of incalculable value. As such, by the laws of this town, you are to be hanged by the neck until dead." Gasps fluttered through the crowd, not at the sentence, but at the judge's audacity to act both as prosecutor and executioner. But no one stepped forward to object. Not the storekeepers, not the blacksmith, not even the preacher who stood with his hat in his hands and his mouth shut. Marlowe closed her eyes. She wanted to scream, to beg to fight. But her voice had long since dried up in her throat, the words dying with every hour spent in that dark cell under the courthouse. Her mind raced back to the day the necklace vanished, how she'd been hemming a gown in the judge's parlor late into the evening, the house quiet except for the ticking of a grandfather clock. She remembered the glint of emerald through the lace curtains as Mrs. Blackwood slipped into the garden, how she'd watched her dig, then vanish inside with dirt still clinging to her skirts. She'd seen the truth. But truth meant nothing in Bitter Creek. She was just a poor girl with a needle and thread, her only home a room above Muller's general store. Who would believe her over the judge's wife? Her assigned lawyer, a man named Hiram Wells, had barely spoken on her behalf, muttering something about keeping things orderly before letting the trial end without protest. The jury, handpicked by Blackwood himself, took 10 minutes to deliberate. Now here she stood, tears dripping from her chin, as the executioner Garrett Walsh checked the trapdoor beneath her one last time. The creaking wood sent a jolt of panic through her spine. Her heart beat hard enough to drown out the judge's words. She didn't want to die. Not like this. Not for a lie. The crowd stirred uneasily. A child cried. A woman turned away. This was Bitter Creek's first public hanging in 3 years, and the judge wanted a spectacle. He looked at his pocket watch and nodded to Garrett, who moved toward the lever with a solemn expression. Marlowe's knees buckled. Her vision blurred. She whispered a prayer she wasn't sure anyone was listening to. And then clank, clank, clank. The sharp sound of spurs echoed across the square, slow and deliberate, climbing the gallows steps like a ghost. The crowd turned. Someone was coming, and in his saddlebag he carried more than just whiskey. He carried the truth. Just as the executioner's hand closed around the iron lever, a sound sliced through the tension like a blade, the sharp jingle of spurs on wood, slow and deliberate, echoing off the buildings lining Bitter Creek's dusty main square. Heads turned, whispers rippled through the gathered crowd like wind through tall grass. The hangman froze, one boot poised on the trapdoor mechanism. Even Judge Blackwood furrowed his brow. A man was climbing the gallows. He moved with a lurching sway, boots scuffed and coat flapping loosely in the breeze. A black hat sat crooked on his head, casting a shadow over eyes bloodshot from drink, or so it appeared. His duster was filthy with trail dust and stained from days on the road. A bottle peeked from the inside of his coat, and the sour tang of whiskey followed him like a storm cloud. The judge barked, "This is a legal proceeding, stranger. Get off my platform before I have you jailed for contempt." But the stranger didn't stop. He reached the top step, glanced at the noose around Marlowe's neck, and gave a slow, exaggerated shake of his head. "Legal," he slurred, swaying unsteadily. "You call this legal?" The crowd tensed. A few gasps escaped lips. A couple of men shifted nervously. No one had dared question Judge Blackwood in public, not in years. "Look at her," the man said, motioning broadly to Marlowe with one arm while nearly tipping himself off the gallows. This girl looks like she couldn't steal a church hymn, let alone some shiny bauble. And yet here you are, fixing to snap her neck like a chicken." Judge Blackwood's face darkened. "She's been tried and sentenced. Move along before you join her." "Funny," the man muttered, pulling himself upright. "From where I'm standing, all I see is a girl shaking in fear, and a judge with more power than conscience." Murmurs now spread like wildfire. Even the stoic Sheriff Morrison shifted his weight. The stranger might have reeked of whiskey, but his words hit nerves people had long buried. Then slowly he reached into his coat. Several in the crowd flinched. Even the judge's hand twitched near his pistol, but the man didn't pull a weapon. He pulled a badge. It was old, tarnished, battered from years on the trail, but unmistakable. A gleam caught the light. Of gasps exploded across the square. Marlowe blinked, her knees going weak, not from fear this time, but hope. The judge's bravado cracked. His face paled. "Marshal." The stranger smiled crookedly, tucking the badge back into his coat. "Caleb Iron Creek Mackenzie, appointed by federal authority. And from what I'm seeing here, Judge, this ain't justice, it's a damn sideshow." Blackwood tried to regain control. "You have no jurisdiction here. This is a town matter, a lawful verdict." Caleb's tone turned deadly calm. "Then tell me, Judge, how long did the trial last? Who represented the girl? What evidence did you actually show?" Blackwood's mouth twitched. "She was the only one in the house. The necklace vanished. That's evidence enough." Caleb laughed, a dry, bitter sound. "Only one in the house. That's your whole case. Hell, I've seen tighter logic in a saloon brawl." The crowd was listening now. Not just listening, they were waking up. Blackwood glanced nervously around. Eyes that once obeyed, now questioned. And Caleb, swaying slightly, took a single slow step toward the judge. "I've seen hangings," he said softly. "Real ones. And I've seen murder dressed up as justice. You might want to ask yourself which one this is." The air went still. The rope creaked. The noose hung forgotten for the moment. And for the first time since her nightmare began, Marlowe Thorne dared to hope that she might live to see the sunset. The square had gone deathly quiet. All eyes were fixed on the worn, glinting metal in Caleb's outstretched hand. Tarnished at the edges, scuffed from years of rough use, but still unmistakable in shape and authority. Deputy U.S. Marshal. A hush swept through the crowd like a storm's shadow. Even the wind seemed to stop, as if the town itself were holding its breath. Marlowe stared, barely able to comprehend. A marshal. This rambling, dusty man who smelled like whiskey and trail smoke. He wasn't just a drunk. He was a federal officer, and he had come here for a reason. Judge Harrison Blackwood's face drained of color, his voice brittle as he tried to regain control. "This is a local affair," he snapped. "Federal badge or not, you have no authority here. This is Bitter Creek, not Washington City." Caleb tucked the badge back into his coat with slow deliberation. His expression sobered. His voice, when it came, was sharp as cut glass. "Then let's talk about your local affair, Judge." He took a step forward, his boots creaking against the gallows planks. "Tell me about this trial. How long did it last? Who defended the accused? What evidence was presented? And more importantly, where is that so-called necklace now?" Blackwood bristled, his jaw clenching tight. "She was the only one in the house when it vanished. No one else could have taken it." "That's not an answer," Caleb fired back. "That's a theory. And you hanged a girl on a theory." He turned to the crowd, voice rising sharp and clear. "Was there a search? Any witnesses? Did anyone check her room? Ask questions? Or did everyone just decide conveniently that the poor orphan girl with needle-pricked fingers and nothing in her pocket must have done it?" And Judge Blackwood growled. The law was followed. "The law," Caleb spat. "You're standing on a platform about to execute someone with no physical evidence, no defense, and no due process. That ain't the law, Judge. That's a lynching in fine clothes." The judge's hand dropped instinctively to his holstered pistol, but Caleb didn't flinch. "Go ahead. You going to shoot a federal marshal in front of half the town, in front of your sheriff?" He turned slightly toward Morrison. "Sheriff, you comfortable with this? You satisfied this girl got a fair trial?" The sheriff didn't answer, but his silence spoke volumes. Caleb's voice lowered, colder now. You see, I've been tracking criminals for 10 years. I know what guilt looks like. And I know what panic looks like too. Right now, Judge Blackwood, you're starting to sweat. Blackwood's face had gone a mottled red. You have no idea who you're talking to. Caleb took one final step closer, voice now a whisper only Blackwood could hear. Oh, but I do. And that's what's about to make this very, very uncomfortable. The tension was a wire drawn tight, any moment it might snap. Marlowe's heart pounded in her chest. For the first time in weeks, someone was standing between her and the noose. Not just a stranger, but someone with power, someone who saw through the lies, who dared to call them out loud. And for the first time in Judge Blackwood's long career of silencing opposition, someone had just pulled the rug out from under him in front of everyone. A heavy silence gripped Bitter Creek's town square. The crowd stood frozen, the noose still hanging inches from Marlowe's throat, her life suspended not just by rope, but by uncertainty. On the gallows, Caleb Mackenzie met Judge Blackwood's defiant glare with an eerie calm. Then, without breaking eye contact, Caleb slowly reached into his saddlebag. The crowd tensed. Was it a weapon, a warrant? Another badge. What he pulled out gleamed in the sun like green fire. It was a necklace, the necklace. Emerald stones caught the afternoon light, sparkling like shattered glass. The gold chain was intricate and unmistakable, the clasp carved in the shape of a rose, the very piece Mrs. Blackwood had described in tearful detail during Marlowe's rushed trial. Gasps rose around the square. Caleb held it high, letting the truth shine before them all. Funny thing, he said loud enough for everyone to hear. I found this buried in the garden behind the judge's house. About an hour ago. Wrapped in a piece of fancy silk, same fabric as the dress your wife wore the night this so-called theft happened. He unfurled the fabric for all to see, lavender silk with embroidered white orchids. Several women in the crowd immediately recognized it. Mrs. Blackwood had worn that gown to Sunday service, proud as a peacock. Judge Blackwood took a step back, face pale. That's impossible. This is a setup. You planted it. Caleb's eyes locked onto him like a hawk spotting a rabbit. Am I lying, Judge, or is the real problem that you didn't bury it deep enough? Marlowe's knees buckled. She leaned against the post, her breath catching in her throat. The necklace she'd been condemned for, it was real. It was here. And it had never left the Blackwoods' property. The crowd, is Tom Fletcher, stepped forward, face drawn with disbelief. Judge, is this true? That necklace was in your own yard. Blackwood's voice cracked. He's working with her. They're co-conspirators. Caleb laughed, but there was no humor in it. I met this girl 20 minutes ago. But I've seen a lot of corrupt men in my time, and you, Judge, reek of it. Sheriff Morrison narrowed his eyes, glancing between the necklace and the judge. His hand drifted to his sidearm. I saw Marlowe that night, called Mrs. Patterson, the schoolteacher, stepping forward. She came to my house crying, said she saw something strange at the Blackwoods. She was scared, said she didn't know what to do. Others joined in. I remember that, said Samuel Muller, the shopkeeper. Said she saw something buried, but nobody would listen. The Caleb turned to the judge once more, voice low but sharp. You rushed that trial, silenced her lawyer, controlled the jury. All to cover up your wife's lie. No, Blackwood's voice cracked. You don't know what you're saying. Don't I? Caleb took a slow step forward, holding the necklace up again. Your wife faked a theft. You used it to hang an innocent girl. Only you didn't count on one thing. He paused. You left the evidence behind. Gasps rippled again. The weight of truth was heavy now, pressing down on every corner of the square. People who had once looked at Judge Blackwood with reverence now stared with open suspicion. Sheriff Morrison stepped forward at last, voice grave. Judge, I think you'd better explain yourself. Because there was nothing left to say. And above it all, Marlowe felt the noose slacken, not from the rope, but from the lie that had bound her tighter than any knot. Shouts echoed, fingers pointed, a dozen truths long buried were clawing their way to the surface. But Caleb Mackenzie wasn't done. He stood firm atop the gallows, the stolen necklace still dangling from his hand. The crowd pressed closer, the sheriff hovering near the edge of chaos. Judge Blackwood's once commanding presence now looked brittle-cornered. Then Caleb said something that stopped the noise cold. His voice was quiet, controlled, but it carried with deadly clarity. I came here for you, Harrison Blackwood. A collective gasp rippled through the square. Even Marlowe, still trembling from the near hanging, turned to stare at the man who had just saved her. Blackwa. What are you talking about? Caleb stepped down from the platform, boots thudding softly on the wood, each step deliberate. His voice dropped lower, dead serious. 3 years ago, the territorial treasury in Carson City lost $50,000 in public funds. The treasurer vanished, gone without a trace, took the money, faked his death, disappeared. The crowd listened stunned. And his name wasn't Harrison Blackwood. Caleb's eyes burned with fire. His name was Henry Blackstone. The judge froze. Henry Blackstone. Caleb repeated, embezzler, fraud, and now judge. You've been hiding behind that robe in Bitter Creek, playing God over a town that didn't know they were ruled by a criminal. No, Blackwood whispered, shaking his head. Lies, all of it. Lies. Caleb pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat and held it up. Official warrants, signed by the territorial governor. You've been a fugitive for 3 years, and now the trail ends here. The crowd had gone completely still. That's when another voice broke the silence, a voice that cracked with emotion. Harrison, stop. Heads turned as a figure ran into the square, Mrs. Blackwood, her fine dress askew, her pinned-up hair unraveling as she stumbled toward the gallows, tears streaming down her face. Elizabeth, get back to the house, the judge barked, panic lacing his tone. But she didn't stop. She climbed the platform, gasping for breath. They know Harrison. They know about Rebecca. The name hit him like a bullet. His face went grey. His knees buckled slightly. Caleb's eyes, Elizabeth's voice was hoarse, trembling. His wife, his real wife, from Carson City. He told everyone here he was a widower, but he left her behind. Gasps erupted again. Bigamy, fraud, lies on top of lies. Marlowe found her voice shaking. I saw the letters, she whispered, when I was in your parlor. You were reading them, Mrs. Blackwood, from someone named Rebecca. I asked what they were, and you panicked. Elizabeth nodded slowly, guilt consuming her. I was afraid she'd expose us. Harrison told me to frame her, said no one would believe an orphan over a respected judge's wife. Harrison, I helped you build a life on lies, she sobbed, but I won't help you murder an innocent girl. The judge's hand trembled at his side. His gun sagged. His shoulders collapsed inward like a man crushed by the weight of his own secrets. Sheriff Morrison stepped forward, voice hard. Put the gun down, Harrison. Caleb was already beside Marlowe, cutting her free from the ropes. The noose slipped from her neck and dropped to the floor like a snake losing its fangs. You're done, Judge Caleb said quietly. Harrison Blackwood didn't resist. The man who'd ruled Bitter Creek with a gavel and a gun was no longer a judge, no longer even a man of the law. He was just another criminal caught in the open. For a long moment, no one moved. It was as if the whole town had stopped breathing. Judge Harrison Blackwood, no longer a judge, but a wanted man with a stolen name, stood paralyzed on the gallows. His gun hung loosely at his side, eyes wide, lips trembling, as the web of lies he'd spun for years unraveled before his very eyes. Sheriff Morrison, silent until now, stepped forward. Harrison Blackwood, he said firmly, I'm placing you under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, abuse of office, and attempted murder. The townsfolk, once cowed and silent under the judge's shadow, began to step forward one by one. Tom Fletcher climbed the steps, his cane striking the platform like a drumbeat of justice. Samuel Muller followed, then Mrs. Patterson. Even quiet men and weary shopkeepers who'd once looked away now stood shoulder to shoulder, faces grim with resolve. You lied to us, someone muttered. You sent good people to the rope, another growled. We trusted you, Mrs. Patterson said softly, and you turned our trust into a weapon. Blackwood's hand inched toward his pistol, but he was surrounded now, outnumbered, outgunned, and out of time. Sure, for a second the town held its breath. Then slowly Blackwood let the pistol fall. It clattered on the gallows floor with a final metallic ring. The sound echoed like a bell tolling the death of his reign. Caleb moved fast. H, you're safe now, he whispered. Tears rolled down her cheeks. I thought I was going to die. You almost did, Caleb said, voice low. But not today. As he helped her down from the platform, the townspeople parted like a sea around them. No one cheered, no one clapped. This wasn't a celebration, it was an awakening. The man they'd feared, obeyed, and even admired had used the law to crush the innocent. And they had let him. This Sheriff Morrison turned to Elizabeth Blackwood, who stood quietly by the gallows, her fine dress wrinkled, her eyes hollow. "You're coming too," he said, though gently. "You've got confessions to make." She nodded, offering no resistance. Caleb walked with Marlowe through the crowd, past the platform where she'd nearly died. Bitter Creek's first public hanging in 3 years had turned into a reckoning. Someone in the back murmured, "Tear it down." Another repeated it louder, "Tear it down." Within moments, hands began dismantling the gallows. Boards ripped loose. The trapdoor was shattered beneath boot heels. The noose was cut and thrown to the dirt. The whole structure, once a symbol of Blackwood's absolute rule, came crashing down in a flurry of shouts and hammer strikes. Caleb turned to Sheriff Morrison. "You'll need to review every case that man touched." The sheriff nodded grimly. "We will, and we'll make it right." As the sun dipped low over the rooftops, casting long golden rays across the broken gallows and rising dust, Bitter Creek stood at a crossroads haunted by the past, but with its eyes finally open. Justice hadn't just arrived on horseback, it had burned the lies to the ground. The noose was gone, the gallows were splintered, but the real rot in Bitter Creek was only just beginning to surface. Hours after Judge Blackwood's arrest, Deputy Marshal Caleb Mackenzie and Sheriff Morrison stood outside the Blackwood residence, a grand white house with green shutters and a rose garden now trampled by boots and shame. "Let's see what else he's been hiding," Caleb muttered. They kicked in the back door and began to search. It didn't take long. In the study, they found ledgers, hundreds of pages bound in expensive leather, each one meticulously filled with names, dates, bribes paid, and verdicts rendered. Behind a bookshelf, they discovered a false panel. Morrison knelt, cracked it open, and recoiled. Inside were forged land deeds, cattle brand certificates, uncashed bank drafts, and a bundle of light across 3 territories. Even more chilling, a hidden compartment beneath the box revealed documents that listed the sale of human lives, indentured labor contracts, mostly signed with an X, mostly women and children. Slavery dressed up as law. This wasn't corruption, it was an empire. Marlowe's case, her near hanging, was just one line in a sea of horror. Dozens of names filled those pages, families displaced, innocent men, condemned women sent to work camps or brothels under legal pretense. Some had been hanged, others had simply vanished. Sheriff Morrison read aloud one entry: Hernandez family, accused of rustling. Father and eldest son hanged. Wife and 2 children sold to Bishop's Mill. Caleb clenched his fists. He didn't just steal money, he stole futures. He turned this town into a hunting ground and the law into his weapon. Back in town, word spread like wildfire. People gathered outside the jailhouse, murmuring in disbelief as the full scale of the betrayal came to light. A storm of sorrow and rage swept over Bitter Creek. Inside Muller's store, Marlowe sat wrapped in a blanket, her dress still torn and stained from the gallows. She stared blankly at the teacup in her hands. Mrs. Mew, but Marlowe didn't feel lucky. She felt haunted. How many others had begged for their lives like she had? How many hadn't been saved? Back at the house, Caleb flipped through one final journal, a small worn book hidden behind the judge's bedroom dresser. Inside, in Judge Blackwood's own hand, were notes detailing jury tampering, property theft, and at least 30 wrongful convictions. Caleb read you, "Yes, it is true." Sheriff Morrison looked out the window at the square below. "And we all helped him do it. We let it happen." Caleb turned, and as dusk settled over Bitter Creek, the 2 lawmen knew one thing for certain. What had started with a single noose had unraveled into something far darker. But now at last the truth had claws. And it wasn't letting go. 3 hours after the truth came crashing down in Bitter Creek's dusty square, Harrison Blackwood confessed. Stripped of his robe, stripped of his power, the man who once presided like a king over the town's fate now sat slumped in a jail cell, hands shaking, voice hollow. Sheriff Morrison wrote down every word. Caleb stood outside the bars, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. The confession he named names. Listed verdicts he'd sold, people he'd condemned. He admitted to stealing government funds from Carson City, forging his identity, falsifying trials, framing innocence, including Marlowe Thorne. He confessed to selling human beings into forced labor and signing their fates like livestock. "I never thought anyone would come looking," he muttered almost to himself. Not out here, but someone had. Within days, word reached the territorial capital and federal investigators were dispatched. A special tribunal was formed to review every case Judge Blackwood had touched in his 5-year reign. Dozens of families came forward, grieving parents, widows, children with questions etched in their faces. Justice, once lost in the shadows of Bitter Creek, was finally waking up. AA. When the gallows were torn down, the townspeople lit the wood in a great bonfire. Flames rose high into the starless sky, casting dancing orange light across the square where Marlowe had nearly died. It wasn't celebration, it was a cleansing. Marlowe watched from the porch of Mueller's store, the bundle of her few possessions resting in her lap. Her dress was clean now, her face calm, but something deeper still stirred behind her eyes. She boarded a stagecoach east with nothing but a sewing kit, a change of clothes, and a quiet determination burning in her chest. In Denver, thorn and thread. She worked quietly, skillfully, offering free mending to poor women, especially the young and the frightened, because she knew what it was to be both. She never married, but her shop became a haven, a place where women found not just stitching, but strength. The man who stayed. Caleb Mackenzie stayed. He could have ridden on, vanished into the next trail town, hunted the next outlaw, but he didn't. He spent 2 years in Bitter Creek, Ove Marshall. "I can't undo the past," he told Sheriff Morrison one evening as they walked past the now empty square, "but I can damn well make sure it doesn't repeat." Morrison nodded. "And this time we'll watch the watchers." Together they rewrote the town's legacy, not in blood and fear, but in accountability, fairness, and truth. A town reborn. The townsfolk learned to live with their shame and to grow from it. The children who had once pressed their noses against glass to watch a hanging now grew up hearing stories of a marshal who stopped a rope with nothing but a badge and the truth. As for Blackwood, he was sentenced to life in federal prison. His wife Elizabeth cooperated fully and was spared the worst of it. She left town in silence, never seen again. The gallows never returned. In their place, the square was replanted with grass and a small plaque placed under the lone oak tree. Here stood the scaffold. May it never rise again. Epilogue. Years later, Caleb visited Denver. He found Marlowe in her shop, still sewing, her hair streaked with silver, but her hands steady as ever. They didn't need to, because in a world where power had once meant corruption, they had become proof that courage could rewrite the story. The morning after the storm broke over Bitter Creek, the town awoke to a strange and unfamiliar feeling: freedom. Not the kind declared in parades or printed on legal parchment, but the deeper kind, the kind that comes when fear no longer hangs in the air like smoke. That morning, a small group of townsfolk gathered silently in the square. The gallows still stood in the center, towering and grotesque, a splintered relic of injustice. It had loomed over their lives for years, not just as a tool of execution, but as a reminder of who held the power and how it had been abused. Sheriff Morrison stood beside Caleb Mackenzie, their shoulders squared as they faced the scaffold. The wind stirred the dry grass around their boots. Behind them, dozens more had come: blacksmiths, storekeepers, farmers, widows, children. They came not for a spectacle. They came to make an ending. Tom Fletcher, the oldest man in town, climbed the steps with a rusted crowbar in hand. He paused at the top, ran his fingers along the rope that had nearly ended Marlowe Thorne's life, then pulled it down with one fierce tug. It fell like a serpent, lifeless and defeated. Together they began to dismantle the structure board by board, nail by nail. Every creak of splitting wood echoed like the snapping of chains. Mrs. Patterson pried loose the platform's final plank, tears in her eyes. Samuel Muller broke down the trapdoor with a single swing of his hammer. By mid-afternoon, the gallows was reduced to a pile of timber and rope in the center of the square. No speeches were given, no sermons read. Caleb struck the first match and handed it to Marlowe. She stood still for a moment, the flame flickering near her fingertips, before lowering it into the dry heap of wood and kindling. Smoke curled upward like a ghost. The fir flames licked the sky orange and hungry, devouring the scaffold that had nearly become her grave. The noose blackened and withered. The steps once climbed by trembling feet collapsed into ash. The trap door that had threatened her final breath cracked, popped, and vanished in the blaze. People stood in silence watching it burn, faces streaked with soot lit by firelight. Some wept, others stared, fists clenched. Even the children understood this wasn't just a fire, it was a reckoning. As the sun dipped low behind the hills, casting a golden glow across the town, the flames of the bonfire lit up the sky for miles around. Riders on distant trails saw the smoke and wondered if Bitter Creek was under attack. But it wasn't destruction, it was transformer. That night no one slept easily. The town wasn't healed yet, not fully. There were still cases to be retried, families to be contacted, wrongs to be righted. But something had shifted. Bitter Creek had turned a page. The next morning, where the gallows once stood, there remained only a ring of blackened earth and a few glowing embers. Sheriff Morrison walked out alone and drove a wooden stake into the center of the scorched soil. Nailed to it was a hand-carved sign. Here ended the old law, here begins the new. And so the square that once echoed with fear now whispered a promise, never again.